Today on my channel, we're going to assemble a Big Block Chevrolet. We're going to go all the way through from short block assembly through installing the heads and the intake manifold. So I hope you enjoy this. If you're a Big Block Chevrolet fan, you're going to love it. Make sure you subscribe below to my vintage iron 7512. This is a 1972 402 Big Block, 396 402, and it was taken out of a Monte Carlo. And so hopefully you'll enjoy this. So enjoy. We've got the engine up on the stand. The engine's been freshly machined. We tore down the engine. It's a lot cleaner now than it was. We started with a pretty dirty, nasty core, and once we got that disassembled, we took it to the machine shop. We had the block vatted, magnafluxed, had the cylinders machined. Basically went through that process. We installed cam bearings and so forth. Once we got that done, then of course, even after the block is machined, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to wash this block in preparation for final assembly. When you final wash a block, you want to use lots of hot water and soap. You don't want to use solvent or brake clean or anything like that. We want to take, Moroso has a really cool brush kit that you can use, and we want to take and scrub the cylinders and use what we call rifle brushes. We want to use those on the cylinders and the oil galleys and so forth. So we got the block up on the stand. We got new cam bearings in it. It's been freshly final washed, and it is ready to put together. Also, what we did is we had the crankshaft reground. This is our crankshaft. Now this is a forged steel crank. It's the factory 1972 396 crank. We had it ground undersized 10 thousandths on the rods and 10 on the mains. And if you look at the parting line here, this denotes that if you look at the fat parting line, that's a dead giveaway that this is a forged steel crank. When you get a crankshaft back from the grinder, one of the things you want to make sure you do is verify that they ground it correctly, because they do make mistakes. So you want to mic the crank rod journals and main journals and make sure that they're within spec. And our crank mic'd out really nice here. So everything turned out good. Now we turn our attention to the block. You want to take the main caps off. And remember, the main caps, before they come off, they have to be numbered, because they are directional. And they are location specific. So this is our number 1 cap here. You can see we've got it marked. Get all of those caps off, and then we can begin to put our bearings in. We have some 10 under bearings here. They are 10 under to match the crankshaft, and the size is usually on the bearing here on the side. You'll notice that the upper bearing, which is what I'm putting in now, it has a groove and an oil galley hole in it. You want to wipe this area off and make sure you don't have any debris or anything left over on there. You want it completely clean. Install the bearing in the first position, and then you can go ahead and put all the bearings in on the upper end. Once you get all the bearings in on the upper end, and we need to check our oil clearances. Now you'll notice the bearing that goes in the cap here, it does not have an oil hole in it. There's no reason to have an oil hole in it. So you just match the tang on the bearing with the tang notch in the cap. Get the bearing in there, and then we want to take and we want to install our caps on the block. Get the bolts, and remember, this is our number 1. Make sure you put the number 1 cap here and make sure the arrow's facing forward. So we'll take our bolts and we'll put our bolts in here and we'll run them down. Once we get the bolts run down and the cap seated in, you want to torque it to specifications. You want to smack this down with a hammer because it sits in a recess to make sure it's fully seated. Then we take our torque wrench, and you want to torque this cap to specifications. I like to do this in 3 steps. I'll split the torque value into 3, and I'll go 3 different steps on it. Once you get it to the final torque, now we're able to check our oil clearances on this. Oil clearances are very critical. So remember, we mic'd our crank, and we have our mic locked here to that crankshaft journal size for our number 1 crank. Then we take our dial bore gauge and we use that micrometer to calibrate this. What we do is we put the mic on the measuring end of the dial bore gauge, and then we zero out our indicator. since the mic is set for the crank journal size, if I stick this bore gauge now in the bearing bore, once I get this zeroed out at the mic size, right there, so that's the size of our crankshaft because that's what we mic'd. Once I get that taken care of, then I can just put this in the main bearing bore and I'll get my reading here. So the difference that we see here should be our oil clearance, should be the difference between the crank journal and the size of this bore where the crank is going to ride with the bearings installed. And it looks like we got about 2.5 thousandths clearance, which is good. So that's our clearance is good on this. Now we're going to go ahead and check all of these, but I won't do that on camera. The next thing is, once you get your oil clearances verified, you want to install the camshaft. I like to install the camshaft with some really good Moly graphite assembly lube, extreme pressure lube. You don't ever want to put these in dry, especially a flat tappet cam. They need lots of lubrication during break-in. So lots of Moly graphite assembly lube, basically smear it all over the cam. And the reason that I like to put the cam in before I put the crank in is because it's a lot easier to get to. So when you put a camshaft in, you kind of got to be careful. You don't want to gouge or damage any of your cam bearings. So you just kind of gently slide this in, and you want to kind of jiggle it around and twist it at the same time so it goes into your bearings easily without. You never want to force one of these in. If you force a crankshaft into the engine, you're doing it wrong, and you could definitely damage the camshaft. Rather, I said crankshaft. You could definitely damage the camshaft or the camshaft bearings. So we just want to be real gentle and just guide this thing in and kind of twist it and jiggle it, and there you go. So once your camshaft is installed in the engine, we also want to put our rear main seal on. Now the rear main seal on the engine comes in a package, and this is a 2-piece rear main seal block. So we'll take our rear main seal out. The lip on the rear main seal actually goes toward the oil. So if you look at the seal, and then also in the seal package, there's this little shoehorn thing that's used for installing the seal. It's pretty important that you use this because it keeps the seal from being damaged when you actually install that seal into the block. So I call this a little shoehorn tool. And this lip on the seal here is that lip that's facing toward the camera. That needs to go into the block and face the oil. So that lip right there. Yeah, if I flip this around the other way, it's going to be dumping oil out the back of the motor. So the lip to the oil, and then you take your little tool here and you wedge it in between the block and the inner side of the seal, and that just keeps you from tearing the seal when you install this thing. And just kind of gently slide that in there, and you got it. Also, another very important thing about the seal is you never want these seals dry. If you put a crankshaft onto a dry seal surface, the crankshaft will tear it and you'll have a leak. So I'll just take this assembly lube and smear it on there. Be generous with it. We want to make sure that there's no problems with that. Also, your bearings, you never want to put a crank on dry bearings. Now that we've got our oil clearances established, take some type of bearing assembly lube. There's lots of stuff out there you can use. You can use even the heavy motor oil if you want to. And we want to smear that assembly lube all over these bearings. Make sure they're thoroughly covered. And at that point, since we know our seal is in, it's lubricated, our bearings are lubricated, go ahead and take your crankshaft, and you want to take your crank and you want to gently lower it down in, making sure that it goes in straight. Make sure it's not cocked. There it goes, right into the, make sure it goes into the thrust bearing. Also, we put silicone sealer on the back of the block where the rear cap mates. That keeps you from having a leak there. Go ahead and put assembly lube on top of these journals because, again, you're going to we have bearings in our caps that are dry. So we want to make sure that we get assembly lube up there. Number 1 cap and arrow facing forward. Again, caps are directional. Go ahead and put your cap on now, and you can seat it down in, make sure it's flush, And at that point, you just repeat that for all the bearings, and you basically got it. So this is the rear cap, and again, our rear main seal goes, the lower rear main seal goes into the cap with the lip facing the oil, and you want to use your bolts as guides. So make sure there's plenty of oil on the seal surface, and make sure there's plenty of oil on the journal itself. And then we want to use our bolts as guides, and also we have the sealer down here to seal the rear of the cap. You want to gently put your thrust bearing cap in. Now the thrust bearing, the two halves of the thrust bearing have to be aligned. This is pretty important. So we go ahead and tap the cap down, and we'll snug the bolts down, but we don't want to torque them just yet. What you want to do before you torque those rear bolts is you want to take and smack this crank with a dead blow hammer in the front, and you want to smack it in the back. And you go back and forth a few times doing this, and what that does is that aligns the two halves of the thrust bearing so that we can get a good end play reading out of this thing. Once you get that done, then you can go ahead and torque the rear cap to its full value. And we also want to verify, you also want to go over all the other caps here. We don't want to take any chances. We're pretty sure we torqued all these, but I like to go over them just one more time at this point and verify that all of the torques are correct and that we didn't miss any bolts. Once you get all of these bolts torqued to their final spec, the crankshaft should rotate without any binding. We should be able to grab this crank by hand and rotate this thing. We shouldn't feel any hard spots or binding or anything like that. It should turn nice and smooth. And this one feels really good. So after that, then we got to look at our thrust bearing, our end play. So the end play spec is pretty important. The thrust bearing controls the forward and rearward movement of the crank. So it has clearance here. So I like to pry the crank forward, and then I'll take my feeler gauges and I will just measure that clearance. And I've got about 6 or 7 thousandths here, which is really good. So this crank, I can actually feel it moving as I pry it, and 7 thousandths feeler gauge is going in with just a little resistance, so we got good end play. Now we're ready to start installing our pistons. One of the things you need to do, even though we've final washed this block, take some cheap toilet paper, not the expensive stuff. You want the cheap stuff that's actually paper. Spray some WD-40 in that cylinder and just wipe that thing out. We wipe it on. Now remember, this block has been final washed, but if you take a look at that, wow, that's after final washing. So just any additional grit that may be in there, some dust from this thing just sitting around for an hour or two, it can all build up on that cylinder. You need to wipe that cylinder off until you have absolutely nothing on that toilet paper except clean WD-40 like this here. So these cylinders are clean. At this point, we want to clean all of those, and at this point now we take our pistons. You can see we got those pistons in off camera, but I kind of want to demonstrate. This is the last piston we have to put in. We have our bearing in the big end. Now these are forged pistons that we have here, so it's a really nice pop-up piston for this 396. Our bearing bores have been resized, so we take our nuts off. And big block and small block Chevrolet caps can be a little problematic as far as getting the cap off. You kind of gotta work this cap back and forth, and they can be a little stubborn, but just work with it, work it back and forth, and they'll come off without too much trouble. So we take the cap off, and there's our two halves of our 10 under bearings. We also check the oil clearance on these the same way. We torque the cap on, measured the crank, and used a bore gauge in here. Another thing that's very important is your ring end gap. Now we've checked all the ring end gaps on this engine, and I'll demonstrate how we did it. What you do is you take the ring and you put it inside the bore, but at that point the ring has to be squared up. If the ring is not squared up, so I have some lower rings on this, so we use the piston just to square up that ring. If the ring is not squared up, perfectly square, you're going to get a false reading here on your ring end gap. So we take our filler gauges. Now as a general rule, you want about 4 thousandths of end gap per inch of bore. Well, we got a bigger than a 4-inch bore here, so I'm going to go with about a 19 thousandths. 18 to 19 is usually adequate. This is a 19 thousandths filler gauge, and it's going in with just a little bit of resistance. And I'll go up one more to 20 here. Yeah, this one's a little bit tighter. So we got about 19, 20 thousandths, which is perfect. And all of the end gaps came out really good. Now it's important that these are checked, because what happens in the cylinder is the ring is compressed and the gap gets really small. It's almost closed. But if it's too small, when the ring expands from heat expansion, it's going to break the piston. So we have to make sure that that end gap is good, and these are. Always put rings back on in the correct direction and never roll them on. We want to use a set of ring pliers here. Just expand the ring just far enough to get it over. If you roll rings off and on, it damages them. So use a set of ring pliers. Once you get the rings on, we want to stagger them. The ring end gaps here, we don't want them lined up, because then you're going to have blow-by. So we're going to leave one gap here, and we're going to take the other gap on the second ring, and we're going to move it to the other side of the piston, so they're opposite each other, so we don't have any blow-by. Use WD-40 on the rings. Total Seal actually recommends WD-40 on the rings, not oil. So we're going to take their recommendation. Lube up the rings, and also your rod bearing needs to have lube on it. We have a ring compressor. This is the cone style ring compressor here, and these are great ring compressors. We got this one at Powerhouse, and this is for the 30 over Big Block Chevy. You have to have one of these for each specific size bore. So we've got the one that is matched to our bore size here. Work the rings and the pistons in, and this is the greatest ring compressor in the world, let me tell you. Really easy to put these things together. Also, the the valve reliefs on the piston always go toward the lifter valley. Always to the lifter valley on V-type engines. So we want to make sure that the piston has a specific orientation, and the rod has a specific way that it goes in. So we want to put our tangs and our notches on our connecting rod. This goes in a specific way. It's just going to drop right in there. But before we do that, there's a couple things we need to do. You need to protect your crankshaft from damage, and we have this journal protector here, and we're going to put this on when we get to that point, so we can protect our crank. We also want to lube up the bearing, verifying that the connecting rod is in the correct direction, the correct location, the piston is in the correct orientation, and we just gently set this down onto the block, and your skirts will kind of guide you into the bore. Now we don't need to put our journal protector on yet. We'll just take our hammer and go in, and there you go. So your piston, just leave it flush. You don't want to drive this down, because then the rod bolts will hit the crank. Put your journal protector on, and then you can drive that rod down over the crankshaft without damaging it. And you can see we've got all 8 of these. This is number 8. We did the first 7 off camera, so basically we've got the short block built now. And of course you want to put your cap on. You want to make sure you lubricate the bearing on this side as well. And make sure that the tangs on the rod, there is a bearing notch right there on the rod. It actually has to match the bearing tang, and there's a number on this one. So the tangs on the rods and the caps, there's a tang on the rod facing the same way. They face the outside of the block on a Chevy, and the numbers are usually out too if the rods have been numbered. Once you get that on, just run the nuts up, torque them to specifications, and once that is completed, one other thing that we need to do on the lower end here is we need to check our rod side clearance. Rod side clearance is the clearance on the side of the rods. Now each one of these rods needs to move independently. You have to have clearance here. So we have our feeler gauge, about a 14 thousandths gauge, and you see I've got clearance here between these rods. And I want to make sure that this rod moves, and I want to make sure that the one next to it moves. They all have to have movement. Every one of these have to be checked for side clearance. Let's go up to the front of the motor now. This is our timing set, and what you want to do with your timing, we did put a double roller timing set on this engine. What you want to do is your timing marks, and you see we've marked them with red paint here. We want those to be dot to dot. That's the way you time these. 12 and 6. Get your timing bolts in there, torque them to specs, and make sure that these are torqued. If they come out, they'll toast the cam. Some guys use this little retainer plate. I've chosen not to. I just torque them and move on. Now we flip the motor over, we can start looking at our cylinder heads. We did have our cylinder heads reworked for this engine. We actually put some bigger valves in the heads. This is the machine shop process that we used on these heads. We cut the throats and put a larger stainless steel valve in. So we had the heads. We've had new guides and put in, new seat work, new stainless steel, bigger valves for better flow. So we did a real nice job on the cylinder heads here. And I won't go too much into that because I've got a lot of other videos you can watch about how I go in depth. I will go in depth, very in depth on cylinder head work. But needless to say, we did completely go through these 396 heads and get them built up. So we want to take our head now that we got our gasket on. This is our Felpro gasket. There's a couple of dowel pins on the surface of that locate the head that are in the block. So we just very gently lay our head on here and line up the 2 bolt holes near the lifter valley onto the dowel pins. And once we get them on the dowel pins, we're good to go. Now we are using a set of ARP head bolts for this engine. And so Big Block Chevy and small block for that matter, the head bolts need to be sealed. So you can see we've put Teflon on these bolts on the upper threads, and then you want to lube the threads before you put them in with some WD or some oil. We don't ever want to put the head bolts in dry, but just make sure that they're sealed with Teflon and that the threads below that are lubricated. Once you get all of your head bolts in the engine, and then you can torque them in sequence. It's really important that you torque these bolts in sequence. If you look it up in the service manual, there's actually a torque sequence that needs to be followed. If you torque a head out of sequence, you could actually damage the cylinder head and warp it and cause distortion. So you definitely want to follow the procedure. I know you can see me torquing them here. I have the torque procedure memorized so I can do it without looking in the book. Next, we want to take our flat tappet lifters, and again, be generous with the moly graphite on these because it is a flat tappet cam and they need lots of lubrication, especially during break-in. So take your lifters, put some moly graphite on them. Now this particular engine, this 396, has a 3/8 chrome moly push rod, which is the bigger push rod and the big guide plate. So this is definitely has the factory valve train setup that was on the performance end of the deal. So this was the higher performance 396 or 402. So these, you can see the chrome moly push rods. Now Big Block Chevy has 2 different length push rods. It has a short one and a long one. The exhaust push rod is much longer than the intake, so that's how you know where they go. So we're going to take and we're going to put the longer push rod right here on the, it goes with the exhaust valve, and then of course that shorter push rod, it'll go right in on the intake side, and they work just fine that way. We're going to put all these in, but I actually want to talk to you guys about valve adjustment. You want to take your rocker arms. There's a rocker arm, this little fulcrum goes in here. It's a half moon shaped thing, and then we have self-locking nuts. You want to replace these nuts and make sure you put new ones on because the old ones may not self-lock anymore. So go ahead and buy new nuts anytime you do this. Also, we want to lube our push rod, our stud, and the tip of our valve. Lots of pressure here when this motor starts. So never put any of this stuff together without assembly lube. Go ahead and put your rocker, your fulcrum, and your nut on, and do that for the intake and the exhaust. Now, when we do a valve adjustment on a hydraulic valve train on a Chevrolet, it's imperative that the piston in the cylinder that you're adjusting is at top dead center on the compression stroke. So we want to make sure that we have our engine there, and I've already rotated the engine to where it is on top dead center compression. Once you get the rockers the rocker arms, the fulcrums, the push rods in there, what you're going to have is you're going to have lash. You see this clearance up and down here? This is called lash. That's a lot of lash. So the specifications for adjusting these valves dictates that we get rid of that lash. So the specification will say run the rocker down to 0 lash, which means I have no up and down play. So you see I've got a lot of lash here. I have to run that nut down until I get rid of that. And remember, my piston is at top dead center right now on the compression stroke, so both of these lifters are on the heel or opposite the lobe of the cam. They're not on the lobe. So I run this down and you can see I've got lash there, but as I run this down, my lash is diminishing. I'm getting rid of it. I run it down till I just get rid of that lash, and I just pinch or just hold that push rod between the rocker arm and the plunger and the lifter. I just go down till it just disappears. I don't have any up and down play. At that point, once I get rid of that, I'm holding the push rod. The book will tell you to go a certain certain number of turns. In this case, we're going to go a half a turn. We're just going to go a half a turn, and what that does is that puts my push rod down into the plunger of the lifter and sets the preload. And that intake valve there is basically adjusted. You do exactly the same with the exhaust valve or the other valve on the same cylinder. You go down to 0 lash, and again, some guys will do this and they'll use the spin method where they run this down till they can't spin the push rod anymore. You don't ever want to do that. That's incorrect. I don't know where that idea came from, but that is the wrong way to adjust valves. We are looking for up and down motion here. So you have a tiny bit here, a little more, still have a hair more. I go down just until that up and down motion disappears, and then I go, once I get the lash out of there, it's gone. Then we're going to take and we're going to go our 1/2 inch. There's a 1/4, there's a 1/2, and now my valves are adjusted. I should be able to feel the plungers in the lifter. I should be in the travel of the lifter, and I've got my valves done. Now at this point we can flip the motor back over. I was kind of waiting for the oil pump, and I had a buddy of mine welding the pickup tube on, and we've got this weld here because I like to weld these on so they don't come off. So I got the oil pump back, and we also want to use an all steel, chrome moly steel drive shaft, oil pump intermediate shaft. They do have that little cheapy plastic thing you can put on here, but I don't really care for those. I like this. This is made by Melling, and it's an all steel drive shaft, and they work great. No plastic in the engine. So once you get that, you put your bolt in, and then you can just kind of set your pump down on. There's a couple of little dowels that are on the rear cap, and the oil pump on this engine sits on the rear main cap. Just work it down onto the dowels with your drive shaft in there, run the bolt down finger tight, and then torque it to specs. Now, the oil pump bolt, the threads of the bolt actually go into the rear main cap on this engine, so you really don't want to over torque or over tighten this because you could pull the threads out of that cap. We want to set our torque wrench for 50 pounds. That's what the spec is on this pump, and just torque that pump to 50 pounds and you're done with it. Once you get that on, we can start. Now we have our timing set on here. We want to put our gasket and our timing chain cover on as well. The procedure that's best for this is we want to use some silicone. We don't really want this gasket leaking. So you want to take RTV, I like the black silicone, and you want to just put a thin bead of this on the timing chain mating surface. So you see we've got that on there. Then you take your gasket. There's a couple of dowel pins that locate the cover and the gasket. So you just slide this gasket over the dowel pins on the block. And you want to kind of smooth out that gasket, flatten it out, and make sure it kind of sticks to the block there. Once you get that on, then we want to take our front timing chain cover, and we've put a new seal, a new front seal in our timing cover here. It's pretty important that you lubricate this seal as well, and you don't want to pound these seals in. There's actually a tool for installing these seals that puts them in squarely. So we want to take our assembly lube and we want to get plenty of lube on the lip of that seal so that the hub of the harmonic balancer doesn't tear this when it goes in. So lots of lube on there. Then we take our you can see this has been cleaned here. We take and then now this is painted black. We're actually going to paint it orange. We just painted it black because we didn't have our orange Chevy orange paint at the time, but we will repaint this gasket, or this cover rather. Actually, also you want to put silicone on the outside of the gasket, cover the whole gasket, and then you very gently take your cover, and the cover actually locates on a couple of dowel pins to center up that seal for your balancer hub. So we want to get these on the dowel pins just like we did the gasket. And then go ahead and get a couple of your bolts in, get it started. Once you get a couple bolts in, that'll hold this thing on. And we can get all the bolts in the timing chain cover. One other thing is, before you put this cover on, just make sure that those cam bolts in that cam gear are torqued to specs. You don't want a cam coming loose. That will cause you a lot of problems. So we want to cover all the bases and make sure that everything is torqued to actual specifications before we cover anything up. So we've got our bolts in here. We want to snug these up, and then we're gonna torque them. So you want to kind of snug these up with a speed handle in sequence, but don't do just snug them. You want to be careful. These are only 1/4 inch bolts. They're pretty easy to snap off if you go too tight. So once we get that on, we're going to go ahead and we're going to torque the cover on to specifications. Then we start looking at the front of our engine and our harmonic dampener. When you put a harmonic balancer or dampener on, this is a dampener installation tool that we have here. So you want to hold the end of this with a wrench or some pliers or something, and then we just take a big crescent wrench, and that crescent wrench goes on the big nut there, and this thing just acts like a driver, and we take and we press the balancer on. So make sure you use an installation tool. Don't pound these things on. They usually go on fairly easy with this tool. Once you get the balancer installed on the engine, then we go back up top. We have our intake manifold gaskets on. We've got all our valves in, got our valves adjusted. Place your intake manifold gaskets on the cylinder heads, and we want to put a bead of silicone on all 4 corners where the water jacket or the coolant jackets are to assure there's no leakage. In addition to that, there are some gaskets that go on the ends of the intake manifold, but if the cylinder heads have been resurfaced or the block has been resurfaced, which this one has in the past, those gaskets never fit right, and you really don't want to use those because they will leak. Very often the end gaskets on the manifold will actually leak from the factory. So it's a good practice to take just a thick bead of silicone, and we want to rub that, or rather run that bead of silicone all the way along the back where that manifold gasket would be. That way, if there's any differences because of milled heads or a milled block, the silicone will just take that up. It's possible that if you put the gaskets in here with milled heads, that they won't fit the heads right. So you don't want to take that chance. So just put a nice big thick bead of silicone here across the front and the back, and that assures that we're going to have a really good seal. I've been doing these engines for 25 years. I've never had an engine with 2 beads of silicone front and back leak, but I've had dozens of them leak with the factory gaskets in here. So this is a practice that you definitely want to do this. We don't want to use those gaskets. So once we get the bead in the front and the back, then we start. You want to get your intake manifold on here pretty quick. You don't want to really wait too long. So your manifold should be ready to go before you actually start placing the silicone. So we've chosen to put on an Edelbrock Performer on this engine. It's a dual plane, dual pattern manifold. So what you want to do is you want to take that manifold, and since that silicone is there, you want to make sure you're careful and you set this thing straight down on. Look down at your bolt holes and just kind of get that thing as straight as you can. You don't really want to move it around a lot because it's going to mess your silicone up in the front and the back. And it could cause your gaskets to be misaligned as well. The bolts on a aluminum intake, it is imperative that you use flat washers. This flat washer here, very, very important. So we've got all our bolts in with flat washers. We'll take a look at this here. This is our last bolt, and none of these are tightened yet. We've just got them hand tight. Now, intake manifolds, especially aluminum manifolds, the pattern for torquing the manifold is imperative. You don't just want to start wrenching down on these intakes. There is a torque sequence. You need to look that up in the book, and also you need to look the specs up in the book. And we want to definitely make sure that we torque this intake manifold in the proper sequence and to the proper spec, otherwise you could have leakage. Once your manifold's torqued, now you can put your shiny chrome valve covers on. We've got our gaskets on the valve covers here. And that's basically it. You put your valve covers on, you button this thing up, and you got yourself a Big Block Chevrolet. So